I appreciate it. So I'm Kenan. I'm from the School of Information Systems at the Faculty of Science, and this has emerged this year with a cross-faculty collaboration, including Professor Matthew Rinner from the School of Law. We have Professor Tan Wijammer from the School of Architecture and Built Environment. We have Francis Nona, who talked earlier, from the Faculty of Health, School of Medicine, and myself. So this is very exciting for me because I love multidisciplinary research, and this is very meaningful. So we're looking into the problem of First Nations peoples facing disproportionate... Sure. Oh, there's a camera. Where is it? There? So First Nations peoples face disproportionate climate impact. So this is our focus, how we can address that. And I will talk you through our approach in the next few slides, and happy to explain how we address that in a multidisciplinary way. So first of all, I came to Australia 10 years ago from Germany. Yes, I have Turkish heritage, born in Germany. I came here 10 years ago with my little baby girl, 6 months, and my wife. And my son was born here. So I feel connected to these lands. And my son being born here gives me a special relationship and connection to these lands. So I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respect to the elders past and present. Yep. So thanks, Matthew, for sending me these. I think they're really interesting because when we look at the Australian Human Rights Commission, we can see that Aboriginal leaders unite to push for real change on rights and justice. And it's important for me to emphasize that because we're looking at a just clean energy transition. And that's why I would like to start with this slide, because we can see a deeper significance here where it's not just about First Nations peoples, but it's also with and for First Nations peoples. And this approach we take to heart, where we can see that the leaders come together from various public institutions, and where the Australian government calls to act now on long-standing commitments to First Peoples. So this is this shows ambition and also an approach towards a more just clean energy transition. But as I mentioned earlier, First Nations peoples face disproportionate climate impacts, and energy is a key driver to that. Okay, so that's why we focus on energy. And you mentioned Sun Cable before, so I'm picking up on that. So we can see that Sun Cable signs what is called a landmark deal. So again, thank you, Matthew, because I think this is an important addition to the ambitions and the actions by the Australian government. And here we can see again there is this collaboration with traditional owners, and it's called Australia's biggest solar project. So this is also what this project is about, that it's about finding a way to not just embed, so the title, embedding First Nations knowledge, but also working together to respect data sovereignty and also Indigenous leadership. And this was basically our starting point. The First Nations Clean Energy Strategy. We can see it has been formalized for a time frame of 2024 to 30. And we can see there are 3 main goals. So the first one being to power First Nations communities with clean energy. And here it's important to point to various objectives by the Australian government and actions that relate to these objectives. So I would like to pick on a few. We can see that there are barriers to renewable energy access and the supply for First Nations peoples, because from an energy informatics framework, so I'm working in the information systems discipline, and what is very central in our discipline is the energy informatics framework. What does it describe? It describes that we have a supply side and a demand side. It's a basic economic principle, right? So importantly, there are key stakeholders. So we have the government, we have the consumers, and we have the industry, the supplier, we have Sun Cable and others, right? We have the energy transmitter, we have the energy distributor, the retailer. So it's a complex network of key stakeholders, and this is what the energy informatics framework is telling us. And here you can see how this can manifest in various goals and objectives and actions, and one being to supply for First Nations peoples. And again, we're looking into a just distribution, into a just supply, so that's why that's one key objective. And you can see that the government has formulated various actions building on this, about reviewing and extending regulatory protections, regulatory and regulations, building on various laws that are relevant in that regard. And so we have these various objectives to power First Nations communities with clean energy. The governmental strategy document also points to enable equitable partnerships, and that's why I was pointing to what's already happening, okay? But we need more of these. So that's important to cover the second objective of equitable partnerships. And we have, again, objectives such as providing fit-for-purpose information and resources. So I want to come back to the information part. The resources are important, but you will see why I'm pointing to that a little bit later. And here it's about awareness, yeah? But also to provide not just the resources, but also the necessary toolkits and also materials that make it possible, but also a relevant IT infrastructure to enable embedding First Nations knowledge in a meaningful, effective, and efficient way. So we have coordination, which is very complex in itself, around policy innovation and other aspects, and other objectives related to this goal. The third goal, and you mentioned the socioeconomic aspects, which is quite relevant in that regard, achieve economic benefits with First Nations peoples. So it's not just about First Nations peoples, we also, and I mentioned earlier, right, it's within four. So how can we strengthen economic partnerships? That's another important aspect that needs to be considered, because we focus in information systems, we focus on socio-technical environment, yeah? But in that regard, economic aspects are still important. If you look at the energy informatics framework, you will see that it's quite relevant in that regard to also consider economic benefits. So we have objectives such as growing First Nations clean energy, the business sector of First Nations clean energy. And I will come back to that a little bit later. A business program, yeah? So a business model. So what is the business model of a just, culturally grounded, clean energy transition? These are important questions that I would argue have not been addressed adequately yet. It's starting, okay, we can see 2024 to 30, so that's very recent and in the future. And that's one of the key questions that we need to address in terms of the business program. And again, you can see there are more objectives and actions related to that to achieve economic benefits with First Nations peoples. And this was what I was pointing to. So we need a network of people, yes? So there is the First Nations Clean Energy Network. And I'm pointing to that because these networks are critical to establish and drive partnerships related to the goals, objectives, and actions that I pointed to earlier, included in the government's First Nations Clean Energy Strategy. And here we can see various points, including take action, toolkit, events, the hub. Okay, so this is that sort of partnership, that sort of business program or a startup idea that can emerge from a clean energy network focusing on First Nations people. So this is one example, okay? And if you haven't looked at it yet, please check it out. You can see there are some exciting things going on already, but I think more collaborative approach and a more closer network between the government's goals and the First Nations Clean Energy Network's ambitions would strengthen the idea of establishing that kind of cultural climate and just clean energy transition. Now, I pointed to the information, okay? So why is information critical? Because in information systems we say we have raw data. Yeah, so we have data, and it's not really sorted or aggregated, or not really. It's just a bunch of data, and in these in these times of big data, we have a vast experience of abundance of data that we need to transform into information, knowledge, and wisdom. So that's why for indigenous knowledge, to create indigenous knowledge, we need data, and we need to transform the data to information, which will eventually be the basis for knowledge generation, and then wisdom to understand what kind of principles we need to implement to make a just energy transition, clean energy transition possible. And we are in the era of AI, of large language models, okay? So we use, some of us, or most of us, or all of us use ChatGPT and other tools to make our lives a little bit easier, yeah? And this is the large language model integration framework. So this is how it starts, by looking into basically two knowledge and theory considerations. So we have the indigenous knowledges at the first hand, and then we're looking at Western kernel theories. So we have that variety of different aspects, because our large language models that are in practice, that we currently use, they are heavily influenced and they are heavily impacted by Western kernel theories. Yeah? So where does it come from? ChatGPT comes from the United States of America. Then we have something in China, I think deep something, yeah, I was checking it out a while ago, and a couple of other services. We have Microsoft Copilot. So most of them are Western related, some are in the Asian space maybe, but the Western kernel theory and the internet itself is heavily influenced by Western thinking, by Western kernel theories, and by Western principles and Western dogmas, okay? So that's why there is this disproportionate use of knowledge that we have in large language models and Gen AI use. So we now see that indigenous knowledges can be embedded in Gen AI and large language models to understand and also to embed that kind of knowledge to integrate this aspect in a more meaningful way. Because if it's dominated by Western kernel theories, it does not really serve the purpose of making it meaningfully culturally grounded and just. So here we can see three pathways, and I want to quickly just go through that, because if we create the IT artifact, and that is basically an instantiated IT artifact would be ChatGPT, for example. That's what it's tangible, we can sit there and use it, it's a chatbot, yeah? So, path one is we use indigenous knowledge only, yeah? It can be made possible, so we can have a controlled environment where we only rely on indigenous knowledges, we have the second path where the indigenous knowledge is generated into the design theories that we know from Western kernel theory, that emerge from Western kernel theories, but also into more prescriptive design theories where we understand what we should do, and this is eventually leading. So we not only use indigenous knowledges, but we also embed it into Western kernel theory. The third pathway is showing us that we not only use the knowledge, but we also use indigenous theories for the artifact design. Okay, so there are theories, indigenous theories that can be used to implement or to develop the instantiated IT artifact in a meaningful way based on indigenous knowledges. So we can see there are various pathways to embed indigenous knowledges for the instantiated IT artifact. And here we can see the large language model procedural structure where we can have a very structured way of explaining the embedding of the indigenous knowledge into the IT artifact, okay? So of course we receive the input from the user and we can use various documents, okay, and extract keywords, pre-process and embed the LLM output, classify a trust level, okay? So for example, what we can do now is we can say, give a prompt or give a command where we tell the GenAI tool we want a confidence level, okay? And then we can understand, okay, how much can I trust the outputs that I get back from the tool, right? So in here, of course, this would be important because we can establish various trust values, and depending on these trust value, then we can either proceed to the next stage or classify that the information that we receive is trusted, or we would need to identify that the input is not trusted and request a new input generated by the tool. Okay, so trust is important in that regard. So how trustworthy is the not just the input but also the output that we received from the tool. And then yes, we can see that through a community of an interdisciplinary network of researchers and through a community of indigenous leaders, we can establish a knowledge network, yeah, where we can have a knowledge hub that is not just IT design specific when we look into indigenous knowledges, but that is also IT design specific driven to create an instantiated IT artifact that helps us to embed indigenous knowledges in a culturally grounded, just way. And I would like to point to a question, or one of the questions that we're currently looking at, because I mentioned it earlier, that it is critical to that we look to data sovereignty. That's one of the main critical aspects because there are regulatory challenges, yeah? And that's one critical aspect that we want to place a heavy emphasis on, because to create knowledge, we need the information, and to generate the information, we need the data. And where does the data come from? It comes from indigenous peoples. That's why that's one of the main challenges that we want to consider in our project and to support just clean energy transition. Thank you. Any questions? Do we have time? Okay.